What's up? I'm KBHD here, and this is the Samsung Galaxy Note 20. It's like the little brother of the Galaxy Note 20 Ultra that I just reviewed, but as a package, this is a very weird phone. It's a very confused phone. But let's just back up for a second. First of all, I bought this phone from B&H for, with tax and shipping included, $1,086. But after using this phone for a bit, it feels like Samsung never really made up their mind on if this was supposed to be a premium phone or not. Like, for $1,000, you would think this should be a premium phone for sure, right? But as you use the phone and go down the list of features and specs, slowly that feels more and more off. Like every meaningful feature is cut down a bit from the Note 20 Ultra. Like the screen, for example, if that's where we start. It's a little bit smaller, but no big deal. It's still 6.7 inches, and it's even flat on the edges, which I honestly prefer. And Samsung still gives you a lot of the edge display features, minus edge lighting, which I don't think anyone considers a necessary feature. But it's 1080p and 60 Hertz. Then has a slightly larger hole punch cutout for the same 10 megapixel selfie camera and the same ultrasonic fingerprint reader underneath. Now, the 1080p resolution, okay, fine, I can deal with that. After all, I actually set the resolution on the Note 20 Ultra to 1080p, but that's because you have to get 120 Hertz. But okay, even if visually 1080p is fine, you still get the great colors and the brightness of the Samsung panel, and it's still really thin bezels. And to me, it honestly looks great for most things. And if you're not a stickler for refresh rate, it's no big deal. Watching videos and taking photos and all that stuff is awesome on this screen. But for the price, for $1,000 on a flagship in 2020, you should get a high refresh rate screen, right? But that's not the worst part of this phone. The upgraded S Pen is physically the same on this Note 20 as the Ultra, but the latency doesn't drop as much because it is still a 60 Hertz display. So it drops from 42 to 26 milliseconds, not all the way down to the 9 milliseconds of the Ultra. Understandable. I absolutely did not notice. It's still incredibly fast and responsive and does all the same stuff I talk about in the Ultra review. It's definitely not the worst part of this phone. The camera array is also cut down and different, as you might have been able to guess from the significantly smaller camera bump. So instead of the Ultra's huge 108 megapixel primary camera and the periscope 5x optical zoom, you have a far more reasonable 12 megapixel main camera, 12 megapixel ultra wide, and 64 megapixel 3x zoom. And the photos and videos from these cameras are honestly very similar to the ones from Note 20 Ultra. Samsung has a look, a very pretty, colorful, saturated HDR look that I do like, and this phone also accomplishes that look. And there's even, again, some advantages to this system. The not-so-giant sensor focuses quickly without even needing laser autofocus. But while you keep 8K video, it also does cut down some of the other highest-end Ultra features, like the 108 megapixel mode. The 50x space zoom only goes to 30x max. But again, if most people just point and shoot and 30x is enough from the back row of the bleachers to catch your kid out on the far side of the soccer field, then honestly, most people probably won't miss these couple of bleeding edge features. The camera is not the worst part of this phone. So okay, let's take a look then at this spec sheet. So Snapdragon 865 Plus, 8 gigs of RAM, 128 gigs of non-expandable storage, 4,300 milliamp hour battery. Okay, so let's break this down. So Snapdragon 865 Plus and 8 gigs of RAM as the only spec, that's high end. It's cut down a bit from the 12 gigs of RAM on the Ultra, but you know, this should still offer high-end performance without a doubt, and it does. Then 4,300 milliamp hour battery, again, fine actually. It is slightly smaller than the Note 20 Ultra's battery, but this is of course a slightly smaller phone. And since it's only a 1080p 60 Hertz display, which is usually the biggest sucker of battery, you're actually looking at a slightly better overall battery life on a charge than the Ultra. So that's fine. But 128 gigs as the only spec of non-expandable storage, at least in the US, feels a bit small. And you know, maybe some people are totally okay with this, but on a $1,000 phone, where you expect to probably use the cameras all the time, take a lot of photos, where you can take 8K videos, and there's tons of games and apps, you would just think you would give at least 256. The Snapdragon Note 20 Ultra weirdly has a 128 or 512 internally, but at least the Ultra has expandable storage via a micro SD card slot. This phone doesn't have that, so maybe on the Ultra where you could get away with 128, on this one, that's all you get. So the specs overall, while they're still high-end, they're definitely starting to feel the squeeze of the slightly lower price here. But that's still not the worst part of this phone. So you have the cut-down specs, the cut-down battery, the cut-down storage, the cut-down cameras, the cut-down display, but none of this makes headlines quite like the cut-down materials. This phone is plastic. Now, okay, plastic gets a bad rap on smartphones. I'm guilty of not really ever being a huge fan of plastic, but I will say plastic has its place in the smartphone world. We've all heard Zach say glass is glass and glass breaks. Glass is more expensive and more fragile, so on phones like the Pixel 4a, for example, you'll never hear me complain that they chose plastic. And the plastic here on the Note 20 is even a little more satin and a little more reflection averse than the Ultra. It does a great job of hiding fingerprints and all the micro scratches that you usually get with plastic. And at the risk of sounding like I'm defending it, this plastic actually has some advantages over glass. Like this huge phone now actually feels and is much lighter, which can make a previously unwieldy Ultra phone suddenly feel a little bit more manageable. And of course, it's less likely to shatter. And at the end of the day, when you guys told me that 80% of you use a case on your phone no matter what, then I guess whether it was the glass Note 20 Ultra or the plastic of the Note 20, people were just going to put a case on this anyway. So I guess it just makes sense for that to be one of the areas where Samsung decided that they should save money. So even this phone being made of plastic is still not the worst part of this phone. The worst part about the Galaxy Note 20 is the launch price they picked of $1,000. There is no way this phone should ever justifiably be $1,000 out of your pocket. As Flossie Carter would say, the price is too damn high. But see, the thing is, this phone is actually not that bad. But when you combine this phone with that Note branding and that $1,000 price, it gets very confusing. But if you just step back and remove the price and the Note name, I mean, this is a pretty unique phone. You get the S Pen, you get wireless DeX, you get the Samsung feature set. There really isn't anything out there that quite matches it in terms of features. It just should have been like $700 instead of $1,000. I genuinely think Samsung was confused. Like they didn't make up their mind on if they were gonna make a premium phone or not. Like it starts off as a Galaxy Note, and Galaxy Notes are always high end, I get that. But I actually really like what they did last year. Not the rainbow reflection part, but the part where they made two different Notes for the first time. The flagship high-end one, and then a slightly smaller but a little bit more attainable version of the same thing, where they sort of understood for the first time that people didn't want to have to spend the most money on the biggest phone, but you still get big screen, stylus for not as much money. So then this year comes along and they do the same thing. They got Galaxy Note Ultra high-end, and then they got another more attainable Note, which is also in the Note series, so still high-end. Also has a Snapdragon 865 Plus, so still high-end. But then the rest, they just cut down too far. Plastic, 1080p, 60 hertz, non-expandable 128. They cut down too far. So I think there's two alternative paths they could have taken, probably should have taken with this phone. One would just be don't cut down quite as much and commit to that $1,000 price point for this phone. You probably should include high refresh rate and more base storage at this point. So 120 hertz, like the rest of Samsung's high-end lineup, and 256, 512, or just put expandable storage in this phone. Or two, just commit to making a more competitively priced, lower-end Galaxy Note. Like they could have just made this the Note 20 Lite or the Note 20e. Swap out the Snapdragon 865 Plus, that big expensive chip, with the Snapdragon 765G. Then you have a $700 phone that you can compete. Big phone, big stylus, way lower price. Like I think that would have been really interesting and potentially really great for this line. And it probably would have eaten alive a lot of the sales of some of the other right around $700 phones sitting at 1080p, 60 hertz like LG Velvet. But I think the reason Samsung didn't do that is because that would have also been a little bit confusing in their lineup to have a new Galaxy Note sitting at a lower price than some of the S series and starts to cannibalize some of those sales. And then also just having a $600 price difference between two notes is kind of a lot, looks weird. So as a result, they sort of straddled all of this stuff, and we ended up with this slightly confusing, terrible deal of $1,000 plastic 1080p 60Hz Note 20. And I can't really recommend most people buy this Note 20 at this price, as long as there's other phones like S20 Plus and OnePlus 8 Pro and others that are just more phone for the same or less money. But if you absolutely need an S Pen and just can't spend $1,300, I guess I'd say fine, go for it, because instead of the Note 10, Samsung just now promised 3 major Android updates for their flagships starting now, and it looks like Note 10s won't be getting that. So if you're in that tiny sliver and you gotta have the S Pen, then Samsung made this phone just for you. If you're not that person, you'd probably, nope, you shouldn't buy this phone. Either way, that's been it. Hope you enjoyed this episode of Nope Tech. Thanks for watching. Catch you guys in the next one. Peace. So shout out to ExpressVPN for sponsoring this video. So you guys already know how much I like ExpressVPN, but now they're letting me give you a little bit of a sneak preview of their new beta version. So with this, ExpressVPN has done something pretty much unprecedented in the VPN industry. So essentially, they've built their own protocol from scratch, which might not sound like much, but if you check out basically every other VPN, what they've done is they've taken an off-the-shelf protocol and tweaked it to their own needs, which is kind of like picking a video game character in some arcade racing game where you know you can get the maximum speed, but that's obviously going to have other guaranteed drawbacks. So building your own is kind of a big deal. So ExpressVPN developed Lightway to fit exactly all of your needs without these trade-offs. Now, ExpressVPN has already been fast, and I've showed that before, but let me show you this real quick. This is me using Lightway to connect to their Japan server, which is about 6,700 miles away, and you can see how much faster that was. And it doesn't just connect faster, I'm also blown away by the speeds when I'm using it too. So it's pretty sweet, and clearly it works, and it's coming to ExpressVPN users very soon. So bottom line is, it's a no-brainer for people to be using ExpressVPN. They're literally doing things that no other VPN is even trying. Lightway, like I said, is in beta, but if you want to be among the first to experience these new speeds, expressvpn.com/mkbhd is where you should go, and you'll get 3 free months when you sign up there. So thanks again to ExpressVPN for sponsoring this video.